Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, but I want to go to Davis, California today, if it's okay with you, because there's somebody there I definitely want to talk to. And besides which, California is my home country, so I always take every chance I can to go back to anywhere near Berkeley, but he's in Davis. And the University of California has a campus in Davis that is specializing in agriculture and animal husbandry and so on. And that's the kind of thing he does. This is Frank Mitloehner. Is that how you pronounce it? And he is a professor of and a specialist in air quality in the Department of Animal Science.
Good morning. How are you, Meta?
I am just fine. I am so eager to talk to you.
Well, it's a long story, but one thing is for sure, and that is that animal agriculture is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases, and particularly contributor to methane gas. Mm-hmm. And so that is definitely the case, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. So there is agreement on that with respect to methane being a big deal and animal agriculture being a big deal. But there's more nuance to it. Namely, first the question of where the carbon that ends up in the methane that comes from cows that they belch out, where that carbon originates and where it ends up, and how long that carbon in the form of methane stays in the atmosphere. Biogenic refers to as natural methane. That is methane from biological sources, plants, animals, and so on. And then there's another one, the fossil methane, that's from fossil sources such as oil, coal, and gas. Mm-hmm. So the question is this biogenic methane that is, let's say, generated by, is that the same or different versus the fossil methane that's coming up when we conduct fracking or pump or drill fossil fuels out of the ground? And so all of that needs to be unpacked if you really want to understand the beef I have with how livestock is currently being blamed for greenhouse gases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's unpack it. I'm keen to see what's in your suitcase there.
Okay, so first of all, in general, and up until this point, greenhouse gases were compared to one another using a matrix called the GWP100, the global warming potential, which simply assigns a value, a factor to methane and nitrous oxide, two of the greenhouse gases. In the case of methane, the factor is 28. In the case of nitrous oxide, 265. And these global warming potential factors depict the potency of these gases in trapping heat from the sun. So, and that's not wrong, but it does not accurately reflect the dynamic that methane has, which is very different from other greenhouse gases, the dynamic in causing warming. And here's why. CO2 and nitrous oxide are two long-lived climate pollutants. Once they are in the air, once they are emitted by a certain source, let's say our cars or fertilizers applied to fields or so, once they are in the air, they stay there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. CO2 has a lifespan of 1,000 years, meaning when I drive to work, and let's assume I were to drive a gas fuel vehicle, then I would burn that gasoline, I would produce CO2, put it into the air, it stays there for 1,000 years. Every time I've ever burned fossil fuels in my life, I produce CO2, and all of that CO2 is still there. Okay, it's a long-lived climate pollutant. The same is true for nitrous oxide, which is a very potent long-lived climate pollutant. But the same is not true for methane, because methane is not just produced by cows and fossil fuel use and so on. Methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. There is a process, a chemical process called oxidation, to be scientifically accurate, hydroxyl oxidation. And this oxidative process constitutes an atmospheric removal of methane. And methane is almost removed at the same amount that it's generated. Okay, so methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. And this hydroxyl oxidation process that destroys it is currently not considered using this global warming potential 100 factor. Okay, so the other greenhouse gases are just produced, but methane is produced and destroyed almost at equal rate. And that generates a very different dynamic in how methane warms the planet. It is the fast and furious gas. Okay, it is fast-lived, short-lived, but while it's in the atmosphere, it's potent in trapping the heat. But that offers us opportunities for climate mitigation, because if we manage to mitigate methane, if we manage to reduce methane, then these reductions can have an instantaneous impact on our climate. Even if we were to stop burning fossil fuels today, altogether, if we were to stop it today, then all the CO2 that we have produced up until this point over the last 1,000+ years would still be in the atmosphere, continually warming our planet. It will just plateau. But if we reduce methane, if the methane goes down, the warming goes down instantaneously. And that really offers opportunities, particularly for the livestock sector. We have found ways of reducing methane from livestock, for example, by managing their manure, that traps this gas. Instead of going into the air, we can trap it, capture it, and convert it into fuel. The fuel that we are producing is a renewable fuel called renewable natural gas. And that renewable fuel can replace diesel in our semi-trucks, for example. Mm-hmm. So we can take animal manure, trap the gas that comes from the animal manure, and convert that gas into fuel to fuel vehicle fleets. And this is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is, incentivized by the state of California very heavily, with $200 per ton of CO2 emitted. And that really is generating a real hype right now among the agricultural community. Our dairies have, by the dozens, already covered their lagoons. It's a multi-million-dollar investment per dairy, but it pays itself within a few years. And as a result of so many dairies having engaged with this new technology, our dairy sector has now reduced its methane by 25%. Wow. And that is a massive reduction that occurred over the last 3 years, okay? A massive reduction. And that is only a reduction achieved through manure management. In addition to the manure management, we can also reduce the methane emissions that come from the animals themselves. And now some of your listeners will giggle, thinking cow farts, but that's not what we are dealing with here. We're dealing with what's called enteric emissions, and they are the belched methane that comes from the front end of the cow. And here we can reduce that methane because if we add a certain feed additive to the diet of those cows, then we can change what happens in their stomach to reduce methane that's no longer or at a lower rate belched out. And by doing so, we can reduce enteric methane by anywhere between 10 to 50%. So I know I do a lot of talking here, but I just wanted to give you an overview that on the livestock side, we are not so much concerned with CO2, but we are concerned with respect to methane. Mm-hmm. And while this is a potent greenhouse gas, if we reduce it, beautiful things happen. And we are reducing it, and beautiful things do happen because when you reduce methane, you pull carbon out of the air, much as if you were to plant trees, which during photosynthesis also pull carbon out of the air, CO2. The same happens when you reduce methane. So that's happening right now. It's incentivized by the state of California. The goal California has is to reduce methane from livestock by 40%, 40. We're already over halfway there.
That is wonderful. And mostly, I would say 95% new to me. Whoa, this additive. I had heard that a certain kind of seaweed can reduce the fermentation in the, is that the word for it, in the animal's extra stomach? Is it a component of seaweed that you're going to feed cows?
Ruminant animals have 4 stomachs, okay? And the largest one is called the rumen and has a volume of 50 gallons, roughly the volume of your bathtub. So, and the reason why that rumen is so large is because ruminant animals have the capacity of digesting non-human edible feeds, such as cellulose-containing grasses, and converting those into animal source foods like meat, milk, and so on. So these microbes that produce or that convert the cellulose, this carbohydrate that we can't digest ourselves, the microbes that digest that cellulose produce methane when they digest that carbohydrate. Okay, that's the unwanted or unintended consequence of ruminants being able to digest cellulose. And by the way, cellulose is the world's most abundant biomass. Okay, the world's most abundant biomass can only be digested by ruminant livestock and by ruminant animals in general. But the problem is when they digest it, then methane is formed as a side product. Now, we have done many studies here at UC Davis, and that's both my lab, but also the lab of Professor Ermias Kibreab, in feeding feed additives, including seaweed. It's called Aspergopsis taxiformis, and things such as essential oils, tannins, other products that are chemical kind of new molecules. So some of those feed additives are naturally occurring. For example, essential oils made of oregano and garlic and so on. And some of them are new molecules that are chemically produced in a factory. For example, 3-NOP, that's what it's called. These different feed additives, by and large, disrupt what the microbes do in the rumen. Okay, they disrupt the microbes either by changing relative species compositions of microbes in the rumen, or by interrupting the enzymatic steps that they undertake in the formation of methane. We have identified 35 or so that were contesters in really reducing methane, but of the 35 that were advertised as reducing methane, 5 actually did reduce methane. The others did not. But the 5 that did reduce methane did so in a major way, anywhere between 10 to 50%, as I said before, of enteric methane can be reduced. And enteric methane is the most important methane source, in society. It's not the animal manure, it's not other things. It is the belching of these ruminant animals that we seek to reduce.
There are 2 or 3 different lines of approach that one could take to defending the role and the importance of ruminant animals in this modern world. One would be simply say, don't worry about it, because the methane that the animal is emitting is simply part of a cycle in which they're drawing carbon out of they emit it, but it doesn't stay there more than 10 years. It gets broken down and it gets it's back to CO2, which the grasses sequester or draw in, and then the cows eat the grass and turn it into methane. So you're not adding anything to the total amount of methane in the world. That argument I've heard, and sounds reasonable. I'm easy to convert on that point. Another one, another one to me would be to say that the animals actually improve the capacity of the grasses and other plants to capture CO2 by trampling the soil and that sort of thing. There is a whole approach done. I'm sure you're familiar with the name Alan Savory, and the people who talk about how animals, if managed properly, will improve the quality of the soil, and not only by trampling it, but also leaving their droppings. And that you want them to leave their poop and their urine on the ground, because that enriches the soil and creates greater biodiversity. So that's argument number 2, but it seems somewhat incompatible with what I think you surprised me by suggesting, which was that maybe you just capture this poop and turn it into fuel. Now, that does seem incompatible with a line of argument number 2, because if you're going to take the poop and convert it to fuel, it's not going to be out there enriching the soil. So you got to do one or the other, but I don't know whether you can do them both. I have a whole different line of argument, which I haven't ever seen anybody brought into this kind of discussion about cows, but it is where I started from, which is a concern about the Arctic. And the work of these people called Zimov in Siberia, who are arguing in favor of repopulating the Arctic with huge herds of wild animals, bison, and even if you could get woolly mammoths, that would be even better, because the soil is, the permafrost is melting and reducing methane, or actually producing methane from the decaying vegetation that comes back to life when it's thawed, and emitting methane from these bacteria. And that unless something is done to trample the soil and keep it cold, that this is going to happen on a massive scale. And in fact, it is happening. I read something yesterday about it on a scary scale. So I whether or not they're right, I can't swear, but I was certainly persuaded by that 2 or 3 years ago. And that would mean that if you look back to previous epochs, the Pleistocene period was one in which there were far more large animals, presumably mostly ruminant animals, on the planet than now, and they were emitting large amounts of methane, but it was just a fine place anyway. So here we have a lot of different points of view that angles of conversation one can pursue. So you make your pick. Which do you want to address?
So I think I want to reply to all three. So first of all, the biogenic carbon cycle is really an important one. It explains where the carbon and the methane comes from, the methane that's belched out or that's coming from animal manure. It really originates in the form of atmospheric CO2. This atmospheric CO2 is one of the building blocks of plants, and during photosynthesis, plants take on that atmospheric carbon, atmospheric CO2, and convert it into carbohydrates that become either cellulose or starch. Then a ruminant comes along and eats the plant material, and then about 1/10 of that carbon in the cellulose or starch is belched out or produced by the animal's manure. And now that carbon is changed into the form of methane, CH4. But this carbon, this atmospheric carbon in the form of methane, is not new carbon added to the atmosphere. It's recycled carbon. It used to be carbon in the form of CO2. That carbon in the form of methane now stays in the atmosphere for approximately 1 decade, 10 to 12 years, and is then oxidized back into CO2. And so this is called the biogenic carbon cycle. In this cycle, we are not adding new additional carbon to the atmosphere. We are recycling existing carbon. Yes, we are changing the carbon form from CO2 to methane, but then back to CO2. While it's methane, however, it has a considerable warming impact. So, but because methane is not just produced, but also destroyed, a stable herd of livestock will not add additional methane to the atmosphere. A stable source of methane leads to stable concentrations of methane, and that leads to stable warming. We must be careful not to increase methane because that would increase warming. But if we hold it either stable or even better, reduce it, then we can have either a stabilizing or a reducing impact on our climate. And that's a big deal. So that's the first point. The second point is the one of me saying that in the dairy, on the dairy side of things, where animals are housed in a more intensive way in barns and not so much on pasture, the manure that these animals produce is not going onto pasture directly, but it's flushed into what's called a lagoon, and normally it would be stored in the lagoon for months until it's eventually land applied as fertilizer. Now, farmers cover their lagoons with tar and capture the gas that normally would be off-gassing from these lagoons. This gas mixture is called biogas. They trap that biogas, convert it into renewable natural gas, and that's then a fuel type. But that's just the gas portion of this covered lagoon that's converted into fuel. The liquid and solid portion of that manure is still available and still contains the fertilizer value. So that liquid in the lagoon can still be land applied as fertilizer. Okay, so that's what happens on commercial dairies where animals are housed in barns. Wherever animals are housed on pasture, you have no control over where manure goes. It's deposited by the animals, and wherever it lands, literally lands, it will have an impact on soil. That impact, if not over-applied, but really applied in the way that grazing animals do, enriches soil. It adds nutrients to soil, and particularly nutrients to soil microbes that benefit from that added nutrient and that increase soil carbon sequestration as a result, meaning the process by which soils take carbon out of the air and store it in the ground. So this is really important. That's the second point. The third one is your narrative around how ruminants have in the past and continue to have an impact on our climate, on our soils, on our air, and on our water. And that's very true. If you go to the Midwest of this country here, if you look at the enormous areas of prairie land, then the reason why they have so much fertile topsoil is because of millions of years of large ruminant herds grazing on it, depositing nutrients that accumulate in there. Now, when Europeans settled the United States in 200 years or so ago, we had roughly 60 million bison in the United States and 40 million large antelopes. So approximately 100 large ruminants in total. When the Europeans came here, they killed off much of that herd of wild large ruminants, and over time replaced those wild ruminants with domesticated ruminants. Today, we have 90 million beef and 9 million dairy animals, amounting to approximately 100 million large ruminants again. So over the last 250 plus years, the number of large ruminants in the United States have not changed markedly. And that means the amount of methane produced by large ruminants has also not changed in a major way. What has changed is our addiction to fossil fuel, which has added enormous amounts of carbon to the atmosphere, not just from CO2, but also from methane. That has changed drastically. Now, the last point with respect to the Arctic, I'm skeptical that an introduction of large ruminants and their hoof action by trampling down the soils will have any major impact in suppressing methane that comes off thawing soils. The soils are thawing there, and that's a big problem. But that is not something that we can, in a major way, suppress or mitigate by reintroducing large ruminant herds. That would not do the trick. The trick is that we curb our addiction to fossil fuel, which are responsible for at least 80% of greenhouse gas emissions emitted by humankind, and try to get ourselves out of this changing climate scenario. That's what we have to do. A few ruminants up in the Arctic will not change that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but capturing or reducing the emission of methane from cows would.
It would.
How much of an impact would that have? Suppose all dairy cows in the United States or in North America or wherever were to be fed these additives and suppress up to 50% of their emissions. And we didn't change the number of cows or how much milk we use. How much difference would that make in the total amount? We have a lot to accomplish in the next 10, 15 years. How much of it can be done that way?
Yeah, this is the frustrating part. There is so much reporting on this topic of beef and dairy emissions that people think that they are making up a lion's share of climate related gases, so-called greenhouse gases. But according to the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, which is the official agency running the inventories for all sectors of society, according to the EPA, all of animal agriculture combined, that's beef and dairy, pigs and poultry, feed production, everything combined makes up 4% of total greenhouse gases in the United States. 4%. The dairy sector alone in the United States is responsible for a total of 2% of all greenhouse gases. So let's say we were very effective in reducing enteric methane and manure methane from the entire dairy sector and reduce total emissions by, let's say, half. Then that at the very most would reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by a little less than 1%. So it's definitely not a breakthrough, but every sector has to do their part, and that includes the dairy and the beef sector and so on. But don't get your hopes up that this will have a dramatic change of greenhouse gases as a result. The lion's share of US sectors contributing to greenhouse gases are those that are related to the use of fossil fuel, and that's transportation, power production and use, and the use of cement.
You haven't talked about this holistic management approach, the system of moving cattle or their cows from one pasture to another in a very careful way, very clearly managed way, so as to maximize the beneficial impact of their presence, both in stirring up the soil just the right amount and leaving the right amount of residue there. Well, let me back up a little and say that I have read that cows that are kept in feedlots and fed grain, as what they call finishing, before slaughter, or I presume that would also apply to dairy cows kept in confined spaces, that those animals actually emit less greenhouse gas than pasture-fed cattle, grass-fed cattle. But nevertheless, this White Oaks place does use the grass-fed method, and they claim that the amount that they sequester in the soil, the amount of carbon they actually manage to sequester because of allowing the cows to live there properly, is greater than the amount of emission reduction that would occur if they kept them in a confined space. Now, this is one of the few pieces of evidence that I have come across as to whether or not there's clear proof that this herding method of moving large herds of animals from one spot to another has any significant payoff. But what Alan Savory claims is, if you look at a map of the world, the land is desertifying all kinds of places. It's turning barren and dry when it much more than it used to be, and that large parts of the world are the land is used by herders with their own cattle and so on. So if he would maintain, I think, that while you're saying you can only handle about 2% of what we need to do, I would think he would claim that if everybody adopted better methods of herding animals, that the impact on the soil and the amount of carbon that we could sequester would be a lot more than 2%. I kind of pin a lot of hope on that. Now, is that reasonable or not?
Yeah, we are talking about some different scales here. So we first talked about the dairy industry here in the United States, and their contribution is around 2% of greenhouse gases of the total. Savory and others made their remarks based on global totals. Okay, and so here, globally, all livestock combined amounts to approximately 14% of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so the United States has about the lowest greenhouse gas intensities around the world, but now we are talking global. Okay, so in African countries or so, emissions per animal are vastly larger than they are in the United States, because the animals are much less efficient in how much they produce, and when they go to the market, when they get harvested or slaughtered. But let's rewind a little bit. So you're referring to a principle called regenerative agriculture, and regenerative agriculture focuses heavily on soil health. And I think it's very important that we do that. I think that improving the soil is one of the most important actions that humanity can take in fighting climate change, and also managing the water, because properly managed soils will have much higher carbon capture rates on the one hand, but also much better water holding capacity than soils that are not properly managed. So a proper grazing system can really drastically increase soil carbon capture and help carbon that's in the air being captured by plants and then stored in the ground. That does not continue endlessly. There's an optimum rate, and after a while it plateaus. But as long as you keep soil under grazing conditions, and you keep that soil undisturbed, where it doesn't stay in the ground is when we do what's called tillage. When we plow the field, anything that plants had previously assimilated and sequestered will be released when we till, when we plow. So Savory and others, and I'm not in his camp, but I'm just telling you that's what they say. What they say is by taking land that's currently simply dirt and not really soil with rich microbial activity, that by turning this dirt into proper soil, we can improve soil carbon sequestration, drastically increase soil carbon capture, and improve water holding capacity. I agree with that, but I don't agree with the total amounts he's talking about. You mentioned one thing before, which was also interesting, and that is that intensive farms, such as commercial dairies and feedlots, on a per cow basis, actually emit less greenhouse gases. And your listeners might wonder, how is that possible? That an animal in a feedlot that seems to be cramped with others, because everybody has seen those images, that an animal like that would produce less greenhouse gases than an animal that's on pasture. How is that possible? Well, it is counterintuitive, but it is possible, and actually it is happening, because what generates the methane in the animal, in the ruminant animal, are methane-forming microbes, bacteria and protozoa. Okay, they are residing in the rumen of these animals, in one of the stomachs. And what these methane-forming microbes need to grow is roughage. Another word for roughage is fiber. And the diet richest in roughage are forages that animals graze on. A diet that is the lowest in roughage is a feedlot diet. A feedlot diet is 80 or 90% corn or distillers grains or so, which is referred to as feed, and only 10 or 20% roughage. When you go to a feedlot, you will see very little belching, and there's very little methane coming out of feedlot animals, because their diets, what they eat, in other words, does not lend itself to produce enteric methane. The microbes cannot deal with that diet and do not form a lot of methane. Mm-hmm. That's one of the issues. The other issue is that a corn-finished animal, an animal that spends the last 4 months of its life in a feedlot and the rest of its life prior on pasture, that animal will reach the finishing weight almost twice as fast as an animal that's finished on pasture.
Mhm.
And when an animal finishes almost twice as fast, then that means this animal will have eaten less throughout its lifetime, had less water, needed less land, belched less methane, and so forth. So the lifetime emissions are lower. And even if you consider the impacts of the feed that needs to be grown for the feedlots, that also generates emissions, even if you take the entire life cycle of the one system versus the other system into consideration, you will find that what people intuitively think is the greener system, that doesn't hold true. So we have to be careful. This is not finger pointing, one better than the other. This is making the whole thing work.
There's a fantasy of repopulating large areas of North America with deep grasses, perennial grasses that grow much farther down into the soil and can sequester much more carbon, and that these are supported by bison and other big animals and so on. So we have this image of large areas of America being turned into the way it was before the people from Europe arrived. And now that's quite different from the approach that you're taking, which basically says we have a dairy industry, and what you have to do is learn to tweak it in such a way as to make it better. And that there's a lot of payoff in doing that, right? By additives and by capturing the effluent from the lagoons and so on. So those are two different approaches, right? Is it
No,
a choice? Do we have to choose between a romantic fantasy of Native Americans on the prairies or feedlot cattle?
well, it's not a choice of this or that. It's actually doing both, and we are currently doing both. In the United States, we today have 750,000 ranches. 750,000 ranches. On average, a ranch has 50 mama cows. In the United States today, 50, 50. Okay, so that is the base of the beef industry in the United States. 750,000 beef ranches on average with 50 mama cows. Now, these animals, all these beef animals, stay on pasture for at approximately a year, little less than a year. First with their mother, and then by themselves, but on pasture. So regardless of how a beef animal is finished, they all spend the vast majority of their lives on pasture. Similarly to what your romantic view there entails. Okay. And these pastures are ranch operations, and they are very similar to what happened prior to Europeans coming to the prairie lands. These are largely grasslands. They might be improved with respect to better forages than what would naturally grow, more productive forages, but these are grasslands. So,
Well,
for example,
excuse me for interrupting, but I think that people who do this holistic management would not be happy with what you've described. These are large pieces of land, and the animals roam freely. They're not that many. They're not very dense. They roam freely over it. Whereas the important thing that these people claim that is to improve the quality of the soil, you have to actually herd these animals in a very specific way and expose them for a specific period of time to a certain plot of land. Otherwise, what they're doing is they don't have any use for what's happening now either.
Yeah, it's a question of management, but not the land use of the majority of agricultural land in the United States, where 2/3 of all land is grazing right now. 2/3 of all agricultural land is in grazing in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, can that be improved? And the answer is absolutely. We can have improved rotational grazing, which exerts more grazing pressure by herds of cattle or sheep or goats or so, and then rotate them around. So we can do better. But the question that you posed was, is it feedlots and intensive dairies, or is it extensively raised livestock? And the answer that I gave to that was not It's not a one or the other, it's both. In fact, if we were to forego the use of intensive dairies and also feedlots, then that would have to be replaced by more grazing with these kind of livestock species, and that would be more land intensive. So, in my opinion, it is not a question of one or the other. It's a question of how do we make both systems work best. Okay, I'm not at all dogmatic about saying because we have a gold standard there, and that might be regenerative grazing, we now have to convert 100% of U.S. agriculture into that scenario, because it won't work. It won't work because there are numerous considerations, one of which, of course, is the economics that make or break something like that. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here at UC Davis and say I'm sitting in the ivory tower and I'm coming up with some gold standard that everybody should aspire to. But if I then go into the real world and talk to real ranchers and real farmers about what limits them and what deters them from making such moves, then I have to acknowledge, okay, I can't just shove it down their throats and say, now everybody do that. I have to root my work in reality and in what consumers want, what producers can do. The consumers, for example, by and large, when given the choice, prefer corn-finished beef, not grass-finished beef. You have them exposed in taste panels to different beef choices, and I have partaken in those taste panels, even with top chefs, and what they said was, I prefer the one over the other, and it was not what people think that they chose, but it was counter what people think, that they preferred the corn finished over the grass finished, and the reason for that is that the corn finished animals are half the age when they go to slaughter. Because they're finished so much sooner, and because this corn fed the last 4 months of their lives has a profound impact on the taste of the fat, the intramuscular fat that is the marbling of the meat that runs through that meat. So we have to consider the reality of what consumers demand and which signals that sends to producers.
Okay, you're dealing with both beef and milk producing cows. So how many, I don't even know what the ratio is. For every beef producing cow, how many milk producing dairy cows are there?
It's roughly 10 to 1, 90 million beef cattle and 9 million dairy cattle.
You're kidding. I would have thought it'd be the other direction.
No. We have 90 million beef cattle and around 9 million dairy cows and 9.5 million horses. We have more horses in the United States than we have dairy cows.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, and those are just for fun.
Yeah, they're just for fun. And we also have 170 million dogs and cats. But of course, nobody talks about those.
Well, but they don't produce methane.
Well, don't fool yourself. They are eating a diet that is very similar to a human diet with respect to nutritional quality. And they're consuming 1/3 of all of our livestock products. The dogs and pets that we have consume about 1/3 of all livestock related products. And they are producing a large amount of manure.
Well, the manure produces methane? Yeah.
Of course, absolutely, yeah. That is not different from what livestock produces or what humans produce. I mean, it's the same. It's very similar.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That is a very sad thing to hear. Because
I'm sorry. I hope.
Yes, I love my dog, and I would like to have another one, but I don't. Okay. So we should give up our pets. Oh dear.
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, I mean, unless we can teach them to eat corn or something. I don't think that's possible. They really do need meat diet.
Dogs and cats are carnivores. Okay, dogs and cats are carnivores. They need that.
Okay. Okay. Now, if you're thinking in terms of how to save the world, there's a lot that we have to make some big changes. And the question is how quickly we can do what, how to prioritize the best payoff in terms of methane emissions, so that we do the most valuable, productive changes as fast as possible. How would you prioritize this? For one thing, we haven't talked about other sources of methane, such as rice production. And I wonder, what are people in Asia going to do when they realize they should stop eating rice? You can talk about that first, and then let's talk about priorities.
So first of all, the most important emitter of methane is the use of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas. Whenever we get this out of the ground, a lot of methane comes out too. And there are many methane leaks in our pipeline system. And so that generates a lot of methane. And in fact, the increasing amount of methane that we have been measured since 2006 is largely a result of our so-called shale gas use, which started really the fracking and so on, that started in 2006. Since that time, we saw methane going up. Prior to that, our livestock herds have gone down pretty drastically over the last few decades. So, for example, in 1950, we had 25 million dairy cows. Today, we have 9 million. We went from 25 to 9 million, but we are now producing 60%, 60, more milk with this much smaller herd. Carbon footprint of a glass of milk in the United States has shrunk by 2/3. On the beef side, we used to have 140 million beef cattle. Now we have 90 million, so much fewer beef, but we are producing the same amount of beef. Really? So these improvements in production will continue, okay? They are not at the end yet, they will continue. We are now today producing 18% of global beef, with 6% of the global beef herd here in the United States. So these efficiencies in production have everything to do with emissions, okay? That's really important. Now, you asked for other sources of methane. Rice is another source. Swarms are another source. But fossil fuel use by far is the most important one.
Everybody's conscious of fossil fuel use. Not many people are conscious of, for example, protecting wetlands. And there, for example, I'm very ambivalent, because I can see why you want to protect wetlands for preserving peat and not having it dry up and burn and things like that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that is the source of a lot of methane. So tell me what should be done with swamps and wetlands. What should be done about especially rice production?
That I cannot tell you. That's not my subject matter area, and I don't know enough to make a useful comment. But I can tell you these are significant sources, and people who are specialized in that area, they need to wrap their minds around it. I'm specialized in livestock, and what I can tell you is that livestock plays a role, and what we eat does matter. But it is oftentimes used as a smokescreen as well, because there are people who say all we need to do is change what we eat. For example, become vegetarians or vegans and all will be good. Well, a recent study went to the extreme and looked into what would happen if I, an omnivore, were to switch to become a vegan and eat no more animal source foods. The result was that my carbon footprint would shrink by 0.8 tons of greenhouse gases per year. So less than 1 ton. Now, is that a lot or not? 2 weeks ago, I flew to Europe. And per passenger, that flight to Europe generated 1.6 tons. So going vegan for 1 year saves 0.8 tons. But flying to Europe per passenger, for one passenger, generates 1.6 tons. So it takes me 2 years of being a vegan to offset one flight to Europe. Now, if the entire United States were to go meatless Monday, 330 million Americans, we would reduce the carbon footprint of the United States by 0.3%. If the entire country were to go vegan altogether, no more animal source foods, we would reduce the carbon footprint of the nation by 2.6%. Now you have to decide whether that's a lot or not, but these are the real numbers. Okay, so I want people who think that their food choices are really important with respect to fighting climate change to know what the true contributions of that would be. And if you did ask me what is the 800-pound gorilla, what is the elephant in the room, there is absolutely no question that 80% of all greenhouse gases are fossil fuel related. Again, that does not mean we can relax toward the other things, but it means we have to have a crystal clear focus on ending our reliance on fossil fuels, and we have to do it quickly.
No, absolutely. And fortunately, I think most people are aware of that. Maybe not. I mean, yeah, you got all these deniers, but if you ask people what has to be done, everybody will say fossil fuels, and let's focus on that by all means. But then I think there's more that has to be done. I think, for example, negative emissions have to be considered, agriculture and so on. So I don't know how much can be done in terms of sequestering carbon by changing agricultural technology, but it's not something I want to overlook. Yeah.
I think a lot can be done. The soils, I already said, are our most important ally, okay? A third of all human-caused carbon is stored in our soils. That's hugely important. Lowering of emissions is another main avenue that we have to pursue, okay? And that includes, of course, animal agriculture, along with all the other sources. Mm-hmm. But a conversion, for example, of biogas to RNG, to renewable natural gas, to this fuel type I talked about earlier, is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is. And carbon negative means we are now reducing carbon emissions. We are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And that we must do. And we must do it at large scale. And we are doing it at large scale. We are doing that at large scale.
In California.
Yes, because we are leading the way. We always have been here in the United States, leading the way. And the others are watching us right now, wondering if that were to catch on. And I think it will catch on. Because this is also not just environmentally advantageous, it's highly financially advantageous as well, because there is the so-called cap and trade system that financially incentivizes the conversion of biogas into fuel, and you receive credits for it called the low carbon fuel standard credits, and they are very financially lucrative. This conversion of biogas to fuel is the new gold rush in California, right there.
Wow. Okay, that is a big excitement to me to hear. But this thing about the additives to feed, because I'm thinking, okay, you can mix up some goo and give it to your cows, but what about the guys in Africa and so on? There's, much of the world's cattle is not anywhere near California or your innovations. How widespread is it? Can you visualize the production of whatever these goo things are that you are feeding them? Where do you get it? What's it made from? Could it be made in other countries? Could it be and could local herders in Kenya be taught to carry some along and give it to their animals along? Very important question. A very important question. The answer is most of the feed additives are not available in developing countries and will likely not be available in developing countries. Now, but that's not in itself a reason to despair, because there are other things that can be done there. First of all, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the world's leading body for climate, has looked into the livestock sector and the livestock sector globally. And they have found out that approximately 70% of all global livestock emissions, and that's enteric emissions and manure emissions, stem from developing countries. 70.
Now, you might ask, well, how is that possible? Why is that? I always thought of feedlots and so on producing a lot of emissions. Well, the reason why that's possible is because in developed countries like the Americas or Europe or so, we have shrunk our livestock herds drastically over the last few decades, and we have become extremely efficient in how we produce livestock and livestock products. That's in sharp contrast to many developing countries. For example, I just told you before that we have 9 million dairy cows in the United States, 9. In India, they have 300 million dairy cows and buffalo, 300. They could produce the same amount of milk as they do today with 1/10 of their cows if they were
Okay,
more
how
efficient.
are you going to make that happen? My goodness.
The animals are full of endoparasites that eat nutrients that we really want to go into the cow. Instead, they are eaten by the parasites. Animals get sick. If they get sick, they die. There is no feed and feeding system that's established. The animals walk around between the houses and eat the blades of great grass that they find. There is no improved genetics for animals and plants. None of that exists in a country like India or in most African countries. And as a result, they need to have that many animals to produce the amount of animal source foods that people demand. A country like China, where I've been well over 20 times, is certainly not a developing country. It's an emerging country in the rural areas particularly. But before African swine fever hit China, this pandemic that they have been grappling with, before this disease hit, the Chinese produced approximately half of the world's pigs, 1 billion pigs per year. But of the 1 billion pigs they produce, 400 million, so 40%, never made it to market because they died pre-weaning, because of a lack of veterinary care, a lack of nutrition, and so on. These developments are terrible, and they are rampant, excuse me, not just in China, not just in India, but particularly in Africa, where people, families, or tribes don't keep livestock in order to raise them and then eat them as soon as possible, but they raise them and keep them because they are their social security and their retirement system. Okay, a group of cattle to a tribe in Africa will live however long these animals can possibly live, maybe 20 years. And once these animals fall over of old age, then they are eaten because that cow is the 401k of that tribe. Okay. But the problem is, if you have a cow that lives 20 years, then the lifetime emissions are enormous. That same animal could be slaughtered after 2 years and then feed people, but instead it lives 20 years in many of these countries. That gives many of these countries and their livestock population a huge, huge environmental impact, or it causes a huge environmental impact. One that we could easily reduce next year if countries like ours were to assist countries like those in Africa or South America or many Asian countries to become more efficient. So they are not at a point where they need feed additives. They are at a point where they need to learn to keep animals healthy, to keep them fed correctly, to house them in a way that minimizes stress and so forth.
This is absolutely fascinating. And we have to end now. We're a little over time, but that is everything I'd hoped for. Because now I come away with a whole new set of things to worry about and to and to celebrate, because obviously you're making wonderful progress. And okay, thank you so much. And I certainly wish you Godspeed in what you're doing, because it's there's nothing more important than what you're doing, I think. Bless you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me and all my.
I've enjoyed it so much. Bye.